Hello, I'm Sheryl McCarthy of the City University of New York. Welcome to One to One. Each week, we address issues of timely and timeless concern with newsmakers and the journalists who report on them, with artists, writers, scientists, educators, social scientists, activists, government leaders. We speak to each one to one. I'm pleased to welcome Mary Brosnahan to the show. A social scientist with a laboratory we can see all around us, she is executive director of the Coalition for the Homeless. Who are the homeless of New York City? They are families and single people, the young and the old, solid citizens who've merely fallen on hard times, and the deeply troubled. They've been displaced for many reasons, but with the same sad result. But they have no fiercer or more devoted advocate. Welcome.
Thank you. Sure.
Mary, according to the Coalition's figures, the number of homeless people in New York City is currently at its highest level since the Great Depression. How many people are we talking about?
Well, just in our shelter, emergency shelter network at night, we have over 41,000 people. That's including over 17,000 children. So that's an all-time record high. That doesn't include the thousands of people that are sleeping tonight on the streets.
And I read the figure, maybe more than 110,000 use the shelters annually.
Right. Well, I'm glad you brought up that number because as shocking as the 41,000 is, realize that that's a point in time count and that over the course of a year we have many more cycling through the shelter system. And if you look back, for instance, for those of us who were in New York in the late 80s, you had a much higher proportion of single adult people. The thing that's really driving this explosion in the population in the shelter are the families with young children. Yeah.
Related to, I assume, evictions, job loss, or what? Do we know?
We do know. Certainly the economy hasn't helped matters, but if you go back to the early years of the Bloomberg administration, Mike Bloomberg, like his predecessors, had been using the federal resources at our disposal, the Section 8 and the public housing. We get about 5,000 units of public housing every year that turn over. And like Giuliani, like Dinkins, like Koch, he had used that as a vehicle to get families up and out of the shelter system. That came to an end, and then we had a series of short-term subsidies that were given to families. I'm sure we'll get into the Advantage program that was recently terminated. So now, for the first time in New York's history, we don't have any housing program to move families out of the system. So if you're not moving families out, and you just have more families coming in, obviously the result is patently predictable.
But you don't see as many homeless people in public as you did in the 1980s. When I can remember, you saw them sleeping on church steps, you saw them sleeping, you going to Port Authority, Grand Central, Penn Station at night, and it was like Calcutta, bodies sleeping there. So where are they sleeping? And does it suggest, does the fact that you don't see so many publicly, does it suggest that the city is doing a better job of providing emergency overnight shelter for them?
Well, again, let's look at the two separate populations. And what's interesting now is that both at the Coalition and what we're hearing from our funders is that people are starting to register larger numbers on the streets, particularly in the subways, or if you go to Penn Station early in the morning, you'll see something very similar to what you saw in the 80s, which is very sad. But because the family system is growing to accommodate the people, and the people that are going into that system have far fewer psychological and substance abuse issues, they're not relegated to the streets as the people are who are singles. Understand that
there are more shelters, spaces for families, is that what you're saying?
Well, the idea is that New York City is unique in that we have a right to shelter that was established by litigation brought by the Coalition and Legal Aid. And that sounds very technical, but what it means is that tonight, if you or I were in need and had no place else to go, we could go to either the women's intake, the men's if you're men, or the family intake point. What we see again, this has been common throughout the history of modern homelessness, is that people who are single adults are going to the front door of that system, and those first shelters that they encounter are very chaotic and have a tendency to push people back out onto the street. With the family system, we've had some barriers erected, but by and large, people are getting in, and children are not sleeping on the subways. If you go, for instance, to many places in Florida or San Francisco, you'll see entire families bedding down in public spaces. So the shelter system, as it legally stands, is supposed to expand to accommodate people and keep them off the streets in New York City, but it's working in two different ways.
Okay. I know a lot of churches and religious organizations have their own shelters, if it's 10 beds or whatever. So obviously they're taking up some of the slack. Do you have any idea how many beds there are available in private or provided by private organizations?
Yeah, it's between 1,000 and 3,000, depending, because some of them are available every night and others are available like one night a week.
Okay.
And to be honest with you, those are some of the most coveted placements, because particularly for people who have been traumatized, if they've been put in a large facility with many other people, frankly, the people who are weaker get preyed upon. And so if there's an opening in one of these smaller settings that are much more manageable and caring, because you have somebody who's a member or a congregant from a synagogue or church who's there, it's a much more manageable situation for them.
Right. How would you rate the Bloomberg administration's response to the homelessness problem compared to that of the Giuliani administration?
Well, there's some key similarities. Certainly, you also have to take a step back and look at what the state was doing, giving George Pataki giving permission for Rudy Giuliani to start and impose these front-end deterrents that we're seeing. It's been the subject of litigation on the single side recently, but also giving the latitude to throw people out of shelter. And so I think we all remember that Giuliani was fairly upfront with his contempt for people on the street. The sort of flashpoint when he said he was going to start arresting homeless people on the street at the same time he was in court, you know, trying to undo the right to shelter. And so I think that viscerally, New Yorkers rose up and said, no, these people need help. We don't want to be attacking or locking them up, that prison is not the answer. If you sort of fast forward, there was a moment very early in the Bloomberg administration where it felt like a breath of fresh air. They didn't want to follow in lockstep with what Giuliani was doing, so they, you know, doubled down on Section 8 and some of these things. But what became clear, and there's a moment when he announced that he wanted to reduce homelessness by 2/3. Subsequent to that, he announced that he was going to eliminate the federal housing subsidies that were so effective in getting families out of the system. And so on the one hand, he's much more—
Well, he wasn't going to eliminate them all. He was going to eliminate them in what way?
Not give families the priority that they had before. In other words—
People who were in shelters?
Shelter,
Okay.
exactly. And so, as you know, it's a scarce resource. And so previous administrations in the early Bloomberg years, they'd used it effectively to get people up and out of the system. And what they decided was they didn't want to be inducing people to come into the shelter system, so they were going to stop that federal priority for homeless families, replacing it with these short-term programs. And what now we're faced with here at 2012 is, at the end of Advantage, which we can get into, many people either graduating off or now, because of some of the litigation, are now going to be abruptly terminated. We're seeing huge numbers return to the shelter system because they're not getting that long-term stability that Section 8 or public housing provided in the past.
Let's talk about, just briefly, about the current state of the shelter system. There was a time when there was an issue with, you know, the city not placing people in emergency shelters promptly. You know, they go into the intake centers,
Right.
and they spend the night sleeping in chairs or on the floors.
Right.
How is the city doing better in that regard?
Well, if you were to visit the renovated path, you know, you remember the EAU, that's what you're describing with families.
Right.
Of course, it's a better facility. You know, people are not relegated to sleeping on the floors. But at the same time, and I think this is sort of the difference between Giuliani and Bloomberg, you have a beautiful facility, but what is actually happening to the families that are in dire need who are showing up for shelter? We know, because a lot of them wind up back at the coalition's waiting room being told that they don't have the documentation to prove that their family is homeless. And so families in the most dire straits imaginable, mothers with disabled children, are being told to go back to inappropriate placements, women who have domestic violence issues, those types of things. And yet at the front door, they're being met with, no, you're not truly homeless. Why don't you go back to where you came?
How do you prove you're homeless? What documentation
do you need?
Yes.
It depends what reason that caused the homelessness. We've even seen examples of people who have had eviction notices who have been told, well, you didn't wait for the actual eviction to take place. We've been told that if you were staying even overnight with a friend or relative, that is where you can go back, even if the relative is saying there is no way. I let my sister's kids stay here for a week and that is it. The city still contends that's a place, that's an adequate and safe place for you to go back to. And this is where common sense comes in. What we've said continually throughout these court battles is, you know, we can go on and on about he said, she said. Why don't we have a city worker accompany the family back to where you're referring them to and see if indeed they can access that housing?
Right.
And you can see firsthand what they're met with at the door. And the city has flatly refused to go along with that. So I think that speaks volumes to, is there really a good faith effort for the city to get families the help that they need?
How about conditions in the shelters? Used to be deplorable, you know, you're afraid to go there, you got all these people, they're stealing stuff from you.
Yeah.
Has that improved?
Well, if you, just on the family side of the equation, Alan Foyer at the New York Times did a great piece recently where he followed one woman with her children who had been placed, I believe, in a shelter in Queens. They were from Brooklyn. The facility itself was very nice, but she spent all day, because her kids went to school in Brooklyn, spending hours navigating one child here, another child, trying to get them to where they needed to be. That accounts for about 40%, those private, nonprofit-run shelters. Increasingly, because the population has expanded so greatly, the city continues to rely on welfare hotels. They're not located, you remember the Martinique, you wrote
Right.
about it, right in Herald Square, in a place where everybody could see the disaster. Instead, they're located in very far-flung places, corners of the Bronx, out by the airports. And so you still have landlords making money hand over fist and clearly cheaper to provide rental subsidies for
Right.
decent housing. And the newest iteration of this is now moving people out of affordable apartments and then giving the landlords this short-term huge subsidies, over $3,000 a month. So that's the family side. On the single side, we do still have conditions like at Bellevue or at Ward's Island. I just met a man recently from Ward's Island, you know, trying to hold down a job but still navigate just the isolation and trying to get back and forth to and from his job here in Manhattan. It's tough.
We're going to take a short break. Then we'll be right back with Mary Brosnahan, Executive Director of the Coalition for the Homeless, after this message.
Welcome to the Solar Generation Road Trip. If you want to know how solar energy is working for America, you have to go out and ask America. We're talking to people from coast to coast who are using solar power every day. From a few panels on a homeowner's roof to large solar plants with enough utility power for a whole town. Solar energy is working for America now, saving us money, creating new jobs, and giving our world a brighter future. Go solar! Welcome to the Solar Generation.
Welcome back to One to One. I'm Sheryl McCarthy of the City University of New York, and I'm speaking with Mary Brosnahan, Executive Director of the Coalition for the Homeless. Mayor Bloomberg had made a proposal that shelter residents who are working be required to pay some portion of their earnings in rent. Did that ever happen? Are there any shelter residents who are paying rent now?
Well, what happened was actually we were able to reach an agreement with the administration. You know, when you say some portion, as it was rolled out, for instance, a woman who was working part-time as a security guard at the Empire State Building, 90% of her wages were being taken to go to rent in the shelter. And the simple common sense answer to that is, why don't we create some savings plans so people can save that money and get up and out of the shelter more quickly? We're all for fiscal accountability and for people helping themselves, but if you start charging people to stay in the shelter rather than helping them save that money, it's just going to keep them in the system longer. So we were thrilled that we were able to reach an agreement with the administration and divert that you know, added pressure to the family.
So people pay some, there's some people who are paying some rent or some portion or not?
No,
They're
by and
not.
large, no. I think that there are some specialized shelters, employment shelters, but by and large, it's more about saving money to get up
Okay.
and out.
As you mentioned before, the rent subsidy programs that used to help homeless people transition out into permanent housing have been cut. There have been funds cut for federal Section 8 housing vouchers. I read that there was a waiting list of 125,000 in New York City. The Advantage program, which provided a subsidy of up to $1,000 a month for up to 2 years so that shelter residents with jobs could get their own apartments. Last year lost its, was it state funding or city funding or both?
Well, it lost state funding initially, and then the Bloomberg administration cut it off.
Okay.
And even for families who had rented the apartments with the understanding that the city would be there with that subsidy, the coalition with legal aid went to court to try to keep those families. Keep in mind there are 8,000 families still in apartments with Advantage subsidies that were paid through
So were they able
January.
to keep them or not? They were
No,
not.
actually,
Okay.
this just played out last week, and that
Okay.
an appellate court ruled that the city no longer had to, while they're deliberating on the underlying issue of whether or not there was a contract between the city and the landlords, had not told the city that they had to pay February rent. And so if you think about it, we have roughly 9,000 families in the shelter system. We are cutting off the subsidy for 8,000 more families. It's sort of like, be careful what you wish for, what you fight for, because the Bloomberg administration fought to cut these families off. We're about to see what's going to play out now if the shelter system for families will double in size.
And in addition to that, there's a waiting list of 144,000 for public housing in the city. So who or what is helping the homeless in New York City find permanent housing?
Well, as I said at the beginning of our interview, this is the first time in modern New York City history that we don't have any program to help families move out of the shelter system other than get a job that will pay your rent. So
At a time when it's hard to get a job
it's so hard
of
to
any kind.
Exactly, to get a living wage job. If you go to the coalition's website, coalitionforthehomeless.org, we've laid out very specifically what would turn this situation around. First of all, reinstating, the most important thing, reinstating those priority slots for the homeless families, not for Section 8 and for public housing. Not all of them, but even if you used 1 in 3, it would make a huge dent in what we're dealing with. Secondly, you've probably read a lot about the mayor's capital program. Many of those units are going to middle and working poor people. The folks who we're seeing are just at the bottom end of the housing and the income ladder, and so trying to divert some of the new housing that's coming in, as Ed Koch did with his capital plan. You know, if you look back historically, again, what worked, Koch set aside 10% of his capital development to get homeless families up and out of the system. Right now, Bloomberg has about 3% designated for homeless. So it's not a one-size-fits-all. We have to work on the capital front. We have to work on the federal housing front, and then also look at what the city could be doing with its own resources.
And I assume the federal government is continuing to cut Section 8 because they're having to cut everything else, right?
Well, it ebbs and flows year to year.
It what?
Ebbs and flows year to year.
Really? Okay.
You know, we got into a situation a couple years ago where it's very technical. The city had sort of overborrowed its allotment, and so there was 0 Section 8s. But we always have those openings in public housing. This year we will have Section 8 vouchers. So I think what we need to address is what is the rational plan, and then lobby like hell in Washington to get our fair share, and not just think it's a fait accompli, that it's just going to be continued diminished returns.
You talked about Bloomberg's capital plan. Is there any housing being built or rehabbed in New York City for homeless people?
The answer is very little. We have, and I sound like a professor, I keep going back to what worked historically, but if you recall, during the height of the insanity, late 80s, early 90s, when the single adult population was seemingly out of control on the streets, both David Dinkins and Mario Cuomo got together to have the first New York agreement to build housing with on-site support services. And so we're at the tail end of New York 3, which is city and state funded, and we'll see, hope, and press for New York 4.
Was this dormitory-style housing that was being built?
No, this is SRO housing, but
Okay.
it's with units that have their own kitchenette and bathroom, and on-site, very important on-site social service support
Okay.
for people who have special needs. And you know, the family population is so large now, we do have families with either parent or child who have mental health issues who need that type of assistance ongoing.
Now there is in the shelter system, there are apartments, I mean, that are sort of it's more than just you stay overnight, you can stay for a while.
Right.
And how many do they accommodate and how long can you stay?
Well, this is what, I'm so glad you asked that question. You remember when Andrew Cuomo first did HELP, the nonprofit that he founded, and they built Tier 2 facilities. They're all around the city. Very well run, these apartment-style shelters. The idea was that after we solved this crisis, they looked like apartments, that those would transition back into permanent housing, and yet we've lost so much ground that's far from it. What we have now is that people following the rules in the shelter, doing the right thing, but at a certain time point, whether it's 6 or 9 months, are told your time is up here and you're going to be transferred to a less desirable location, places that are called next step facilities. I'll just bring up a woman that I met recently at the coalition office, mother of 3, her oldest daughter had spina bifida, her youngest child had learning disabilities. You know, just a wonderful woman, somehow, despite daughters going to different schools, was working part-time as a home health aide, followed all the rules, was in a decent facility. One day came home and had a notice on her bed, your time is up. She was being transferred to a next step shelter because she hadn't gotten to the point in her employment where she could afford to get up and out of the shelter system. So it sort of speaks to this underlying dearth of jobs that people can transition into and housing that people can live in.
And what's the next step? What's the next step?
Next step facility. There's one on the Lower East Side. They're dotted throughout the city, and it's a place where it's sort of the Get Tough model. The communal bathrooms where there's no kitchen. The idea is your time is up. You need to get serious about getting up and out. And what we're seeing is that it's not troublemakers. It's not people who aren't willing to follow the rules. Increasingly, because the population is so large, it's just that there's no way out. There's no hand helping them with that long-term subsidy that they need.
In December, the City Council sued the Bloomberg administration over new policy which said that single adults going to city shelters would have to be interviewed. It would have to prove that they had no other housing options, such as staying with relatives or friends. So what's wrong with that policy? Shouldn't shelters be for people who have no other option?
Well, actually, the shelter, the agreement, the Callahan consent decree that was reached after the litigation that the coalition brought, very clearly said that people had to meet the means test for welfare, and also that either that and or they were eligible because they were physically, mentally, or socially dysfunctional. If you actually look at what you said, of course it makes sense that the shelter should be a place of last resort. But when you look at the actual document that the Bloomberg people put together, it was far more onerous. People were told that they had to actually document their year-long history of where they slept, if they on what street corner, on what bench, with what person, and even going farther than what exists now with the families. If you say, for instance, that you had stayed with a friend or a relative, even for an evening, even if that friend or relative said that you cannot come back, we consider that an alternate place that you can go to. And so, again,
okay,
folks
so it's too onerous. So where is that now?
Where is it now is that thanks to Chris Quinn's leadership, we've won the first round. Chris Quinn brought a lawsuit saying, first of all, you didn't inform the city, you didn't even follow your own rulemaking, the city charter's rulemaking laws. And secondly, the underlying issue is that anybody who deals with the single adult population knows that we're dealing with people. Nobody's going to go to Bellevue Men's Shelter if they have another place to go to. It's that bad of a place to wind up, and that the idea that somehow people are gaming the system is just preposterous. What I find.
So where does it stand?
Where does it stand now is that we've won the first round, and the judge will take up the underlying issue of whether or not this goes against the Callahan consent decree.
We've got 1 minute left. Realistically, what would be the elements of it? You know, given the current state of the economy, more homeless people, fewer government resources. what would be the elements of a feasible plan for addressing the homeless situation in New York City? If you could just-
Yeah, it's not rocket science. We know it works. It's worked in the past. We need to get the federal resources marshaled. We need to develop the capital resources that are at our disposal and have been set aside. And we need to have a front-end system that allows people to come in and get the help they need at the
and
end of the
provide
day.
some kind of clear path out of the shelter
Exactly.
system
So it's
into
not a-
permanent housing.
Exactly, so that it's not just a dead end.
Okay. This has always been one of the most difficult problems in New York City to solve. Just because real estate is so expensive, housing is. I think I once wrote in a column that decent, low-cost housing in New York City is like gold ore, and you have everybody prospecting for it. So. I want to thank Mayor Brosnahan, Executive Director of the Coalition for the Homeless, for joining me today. If you'd like more information on the organization's work, you can go to the Coalition's website at coalitionforthehomeless.org. For the City University of New York and CUNY TV, I'm Sheryl McCarthy.